Hey guys, today I want to share with you a new air note that I just picked up. This is what you would call a flood pattern ink smear air note. So what is a flood pattern ink smear air? So an ink smear air would be an air due to excess ink that's printed onto the note that uses plates that were improperly cleaned. So the flood pattern ink smear is just an ink smear that occurs during the setup of the printing shift at the BEP. So let me explain by first describing the printing press and its process. So inside of the printing press, there's an ink fountain, and the ink fountain essentially floods or what they call charges the printing plate. That's essentially just means that it feeds ink into the engraved intaglio design. And any of that surplus ink that remains on the surface of the plate, that's wiped away with a mechanical wiper. So next step would be papers pressed into the plate, and after that printing, they would apply a solvent solution, and that will dilute any of the remaining ink, and then that's wiped away. So in summary, you have 4 steps. You have 1, the flooding of the plates or the charging of the plates; 2, the wiping of the excess ink away; 3, the printing; and then finally 4, the cleaning of the plate with the solvent solution. And this process is repeated. So having said that, how is the flood pattern ink smear air created? So as I mentioned earlier, during the setup of the printing shift at the BEP, the operator of the printing press will create something called a flood pattern test note sheet. So this test note sheet essentially helps that operator see or gauge whether the ink is properly filling into the intaglio design, how the ink is adhering to the paper, etc. So after that sheet of test notes is printed and examined, that note is generally removed from the press and destroyed. So as you can see, my example clearly was not destroyed, and judging by its GEMONC 65 PPQ grade, it appears this one escaped circulation and was probably intentionally saved, and that's usually frowned upon at the BEP. So let me show you examples of what a normal ink smear air looks like versus what flood pattern ink smear airs look like. So this is a traditional ink smear air. This would be considered moderate size. Here's another one. This one's courtesy of the Dennis Huff collection. We have a minor one here, but this one falls dead smack in the middle of the portrait of Andrew Jackson. This one is my favorite. This one is on the top of the head of Ulysses S. Grant. Looks like he was tarred or slimed. These ink smear airs that happen to fall in the face of the note, they usually go for a large premium. Here's one that's labeled ink smear air. This one would be borderline like a flood pattern ink smear air. Here's a moderate flood pattern ink smear. You can see from the edges of the ink, there's almost like a spray paint gradient, and that's a result of the solvent solution that dilutes the ink. And this would be what you typically would see for a full flood pattern ink smear. And this would be a partial. Again, you can see that airbrush effect. That's the solvent solution diluting the ink. Okay, so my note, the ink smear covers about 20% of the face of the note, so this would be considered a moderate air. Now, I was drawn to this note because of the eye appeal. As you can see, or I've never personally have seen another ink smear that looks like this. It reminds me of that psychologist test. What is it called? The Rorschach ink blot test. Now that's a test where the psychiatrist will ask you to look at the ink blot and tell them what you see. Regarding the rarity of these flood pattern test notes, now on Heritage Auctions, in their auction write-ups, they describe any flood pattern test notes as extremely rare. So take that for what it's worth. I have the older version of Fred Bart's U.S. Paper Money Heirs book, and I think the second edition, so 20 years old. He doesn't mention any of the flood pattern test notes in that book, but I've heard that the new one that just came out does, so I do have that on order. So I look forward to receiving that and trying to learn more about these heirs. Now, regarding traditional ink smear heirs, I know those are probably some of the most common heirs that you could find on a small size banknotes, and they're also commonly faked. I do want to make a note of how to differentiate between fake versus authentic ink smear heirs. So the ink that's used by the BEP would be an oil-based ink. So oil-based inks generally will not bleed through or oversaturate the paper. So as you can see, you cannot tell by looking through the other side. Whereas if it's a forgery, people generally only have access to a water-based ink, and that will saturate, and you'd be able to see it through the paper. Okay, so in closing, leave me a comment. Let me know about your experience with flood pattern ink smear heir notes. As I mentioned, I'm trying to better understand the rarity. Also, let me know, do these type of heir notes appeal to you? And finally, do you see anything when you stare into this ink blot? Let me know what you see. Thanks for watching.